The words echoed through the executive office like a gunshot. Daniel Carter stood completely still, his hand resting on the back of the chair he had occupied every morning for 6 years. Around him, expensive suits watched in uncomfortable silence. His CEO, Richard Blake, stood behind a massive glass desk, his expression cold and impatient. Daniel had expected a difficult meeting, but not this. He had a 7-year-old daughter waiting for him at home, a mortgage overdue, and barely enough savings to survive another month. Still, he refused to beg. He simply looked at Richard and asked, "May I take the envelope from my desk?" Richard frowned. "What envelope?" Daniel gave him a tired smile. "You'll understand when you open it." Daniel turned away before anyone could see the tears gathering in his eyes. He walked toward his small desk outside the executive office, where his personal belongings were neatly arranged. A framed photograph of his daughter, Emily, stood beside an old coffee mug. There was also a small wooden box his late wife had given him before she died. Daniel carefully picked up the photograph, slipped it into his coat pocket, and left everything else behind. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply placed a plain white envelope on the center of his desk and walked toward the elevator. Richard watched him disappear through the glass doors. Something about Daniel's calmness irritated him. Most employees begged when they were fired. Some shouted. Others demanded explanations. Daniel had done none of those things. He had only asked about an envelope. Richard stared at the white rectangle sitting several yards away and suddenly felt an uncomfortable curiosity. "What's in that envelope?" he muttered. Nobody answered. His assistant, Melissa, looked down at her tablet. She had known Daniel for years and quietly admired him. She finally said, "Sir, maybe you should read it." Richard's jaw tightened. "Fine." He walked toward Daniel's desk. But before he reached it, his phone rang. It was the chairman of the board, Victor Grant. Richard answered with an annoyed tone. "Victor, I'm busy." The voice on the other end sounded unusually serious. "Richard, where is Daniel Carter?" Richard glanced toward the elevator. "He's been terminated." There was a long silence. Then Victor asked, "You fired him?" Richard shrugged. He wasn't performing anymore. Victor's voice became sharper. "That's impossible. Daniel is the reason our compliance division hasn't collapsed." Richard rolled his eyes. "He's an administrator, Victor, not some irreplaceable genius." Victor took a breath. "Richard, what exactly did you fire him over?" Richard hesitated. "Budget restructuring." Victor's response came immediately. "That's not what I asked." Richard looked at the envelope again. There were performance concerns. Victor went silent for several seconds before saying, "You need to come downstairs." "Right now." Richard frowned. "Why?" Victor answered quietly, "Because the auditors arrived this morning, and they specifically asked for Daniel Carter." Richard's face changed. "Auditors?" Victor said, "Federal auditors. They requested every file Daniel handled during the last 18 months. Richard felt his stomach tighten. He looked toward the envelope again. Suddenly, the simple white paper seemed far more threatening than it had moments earlier. Richard ended the call and approached Daniel's desk. Melissa followed him. He picked up the envelope. His name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. No company logo. No dramatic warning. Just 2 words, "For Richard." Richard opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He unfolded it, expecting a resignation statement or angry accusation. Instead, he saw a list of 12 dates, followed by numbers and names. At the bottom was one sentence that made his blood run cold: "I protected the company as long as I could. These records explain why." Richard stared at the page without blinking. Melissa leaned closer. What does it say? Richard didn't answer. He looked at the first date. It was 14 months earlier. Beside it was the name of a private consulting company Richard recognized immediately. That company had been approved by the board to provide cybersecurity services. Richard remembered signing the contract himself. The amount was enormous, nearly $4 million. But the document in his hand suggested something else. Daniel had written the payment amount, the recipient, and another company linked to the same address. Richard's breathing became slower. He turned the page over. There was another sheet beneath it, filled with bank transfer references. Melissa whispered, "Sir?" Richard finally said, "Call legal." She reached for her phone. Richard stopped her. "No. Wait." He looked toward the elevator doors. Daniel was already gone. For the first time, Richard wondered whether the man he had just humiliated had known this day was coming. He looked back at the paperwork. There were transactions involving vendors, contractors, and shell companies. Several payments had been approved through Richard's office. Yet every suspicious transaction carried one strange detail: Daniel had flagged it. Again and again, Daniel had warned management. Again and again, his warnings had been ignored. Richard sat down heavily in Daniel's chair. Memories began returning. Daniel had asked questions during budget meetings. Daniel had requested audits. Daniel had objected to rushed contracts. Richard had dismissed him as overly cautious. Once, Daniel had even told him, "Sir, if we don't investigate this, the company could face serious consequences." Richard had laughed and told him to focus on his own department. Now those words sounded completely different. Melissa stood beside the desk, reading over his shoulder. "These are your approvals," she whispered. Richard immediately snapped, "I know what they are." But his voice lacked confidence. The room suddenly felt much smaller. At that exact moment, Daniel sat on a crowded city bus, holding Emily's photograph in his hand. He had promised himself he wouldn't cry until he reached home. But when he saw a father helping his little boy with a school bag, his eyes filled with tears. Emily had asked him that morning, "Daddy, are you coming to my school performance Friday?" Daniel had smiled and promised yes. Now he wasn't sure how he would pay the electricity bill, let alone take time off work. Yet he felt strangely relieved. For years, he had lived under pressure, watching people above him make dangerous decisions while he tried to protect the company from consequences. When Daniel arrived home, Emily ran to the door. "Daddy!" She wrapped her arms around his waist. Daniel hugged her tightly. "Hey, princess." She looked at his face and immediately knew something was wrong. Did something happen? Daniel knelt beside her. "Daddy lost his job today." Emily's smile disappeared. "Are you sad?" Daniel nodded. "A little." She thought for a moment and then said, "It's okay. You're still my daddy." Daniel closed his eyes. Those 6 words broke through every wall he had built around himself. He hugged her again and whispered, "That's the most important job I've ever had." Emily smiled and held him tighter. Back at Blake Industries, panic had begun spreading. The legal department entered the executive office. The chief financial officer arrived moments later. Victor Grant joined them by video conference. Richard placed Daniel's envelope on the table. "I think we have a problem," he said. Victor answered, "You don't think? You have a problem." The CFO examined the documents and quickly became pale. "These transfers are real?" Richard asked, "Could they be mistakes?" The CFO shook his head. "Not 12 times. And these signatures," he stopped. Richard leaned forward. "What?" The CFO looked directly at him. "Some of these authorizations came from your office." Richard stood abruptly. I didn't authorize fraud. Victor replied, then someone used your authority. Richard paced across the room. Who? Nobody answered. The CFO pulled up internal records. There are encrypted files Daniel created months ago. He requested access to the audit archive, but his request was denied. Richard stopped walking. Who denied it? The CFO looked at him. Your office. Richard felt the room spin. He remembered telling Daniel to stop digging into vendor relationships because it was above his pay grade. He had assumed Daniel was being difficult. Now he realized Daniel had been trying to warn him. The envelope wasn't revenge. It was evidence. Meanwhile, Daniel's phone rang. It was Melissa. He stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Hello? Her voice was shaking. Daniel, you need to listen carefully. Daniel sat at the kitchen table while Emily colored beside him. What's happening? Melissa whispered, they found the files. Daniel closed his eyes. I know. You knew? That's why I left the envelope. Melissa asked, why didn't you tell me? Daniel looked at Emily. Because I wasn't sure who I could trust. Melissa became quiet. Then she said, Richard is asking where you stored the backup. Daniel's expression hardened. Tell him nothing. She whispered, I won't. The next morning, Richard arrived at Daniel's house with 2 lawyers. Daniel opened the door and stared at him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Richard looked exhausted. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his eyes red from a sleepless night. Daniel, we need to talk. Daniel stepped outside and closed the door behind him so Emily wouldn't hear. About what? Richard swallowed. The documents. Daniel nodded. You found them? Yes. Richard lowered his voice. I need to know where the complete records are. Daniel looked directly into his eyes. You fired me yesterday. Richard looked away. I made a mistake. Daniel replied, you made several. Richard expected anger, but Daniel remained calm. Why didn't you expose everything before? Richard asked. Daniel answered, because I wanted to protect the employees who had nothing to do with it. Richard stared at him. Daniel continued, if I had released everything immediately, the company could have collapsed overnight. Thousands of people would have lost their jobs. So I documented everything and waited. Richard's voice softened. You were protecting us. Daniel shook his head. I was protecting innocent people. That sentence hit Richard harder than any accusation. He finally understood that Daniel had never been fighting for his position. He had been fighting for everyone else's future. Richard asked, what do you want? Daniel looked almost surprised. Want? Richard nodded. Money? Your job back? Daniel shook his head. I want an independent investigation. I want every employee involved in the fraud protected. And I want you to stop blaming people who tried to warn you. Richard lowered his eyes. And if I agree? Daniel replied, then I'll give the investigators everything I have. Richard nodded slowly. You'll have it. Daniel extended his hand. Richard stared at it before shaking it. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an agreement between 2 men standing on opposite sides of a painful truth. 2 days later, the investigation became public. News crews surrounded Blake Industries. Employees arrived frightened and confused. Several executives resigned. Accounts were frozen. Vendors were questioned. Richard remained in his office while investigators searched cabinets and computers. During the investigation, they discovered that millions of dollars had been diverted through fake consulting companies. Daniel's warnings had been buried repeatedly. Worse, several executives had manipulated financial records to hide the losses. Richard wasn't the mastermind, but his negligence had allowed the scheme to continue. The board removed him as CEO pending investigation. For the first time in 15 years, Richard walked out of his own building without anyone applauding. Daniel, meanwhile, had no job and very little money. Yet something unexpected happened. The board contacted him. Victor offered him the position of interim compliance director. Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to return to the same environment. Victor understood. Then name your conditions, he said. Daniel asked for independent oversight, stronger employee protections, transparent reporting, and complete authority over compliance investigations. Victor agreed. Daniel accepted, not because he wanted revenge, but because he believed the company could still be saved. His first decision was to protect the employees who had been ignored. His second was to create an anonymous reporting system so nobody would ever be afraid to speak again. Weeks passed. Emily noticed her father smiling more often. Daniel still worked long hours, but the fear in his eyes was gone. One Friday evening, he attended Emily's school performance. She stood on stage among dozens of children, nervously searching the audience. When she saw him, her face lit up. Daniel raised his hand and smiled. After the performance, Emily ran into his arms. "You came," she shouted. Daniel laughed. "I promised." She looked at him proudly. "Are you the boss now?" Daniel chuckled. "Not exactly." Emily thought about it and said, "You're the boss of keeping promises." Daniel smiled. "That's a pretty important job." She nodded seriously. "The most important." Months later, Richard requested a meeting with Daniel. He no longer wore expensive suits. His confidence had disappeared, replaced by humility. He sat across from Daniel in a quiet conference room. "I owe you an apology," Richard said. Daniel listened. "I treated you like an obstacle when you were trying to protect the company. I humiliated you in front of everyone. I fired you because I was too proud to admit you were right." Daniel remained silent. Richard continued, "I don't expect forgiveness." Daniel finally spoke. "You're right. You shouldn't expect it." Richard nodded. Then Daniel added, "But you should learn from it." "Richard."